comments, questions, queries. We have a microphone coming over there, and if you just tell us who you are and put your point, and I'll take a couple of others.
Okay, I'm going to stand where everyone can see me.
Good woman.
Okay. My name is Virginia Magwaza. I'm from South Africa. I represent an organization called Parents, Families and Friends of the South African Queers. I also work with the other foundation. Since this morning, I've been challenged by the presentations from the panelists. And the presentation from the legal expert actually took me back home. In South Africa, just to give a background, in South Africa we have Civil Union Act. And the reason why it is Civil Union Act is because the religious people, when we were advocating for right to marry, they're saying they cannot call it marriage because marriage is a sacred institute. And therefore, we remain with the Civil Unions Act. It has all the problems that, I can't remember the name, but yes, he pointed out. And so my question is, when you were doing this campaign, which became successful, what was the response of the religious people in this country? Maybe you don't have a strong religious component like in South Africa we have. Oh, okay. But we also have traditional fundamentalists who feel that, marriage is between men and a woman. So it will be interesting also to just also hear more about the challenges that you faced with regard to different groups. And I would like to appeal to people that when they speak, please be slow, because some accents are very difficult to, I'm sorry, so that I can understand some of the issues that are being raised from the floor.
Point well made. Just to remind people, there is a workshop tomorrow afternoon called Managing the Opposition, and that will deal directly and specifically in depth with the point you make. But I'll come to some of the panellists on their view of how well was there opposition, and if there was, how well was it managed. Take a second point from here, and then there's a third one.
My name is Declan. I'm from an organisation called Cara Fred, which deals with LGBT youth in Northern Ireland. I'm also a member of the Coalition campaign for civil marriage equality in Northern Ireland. One of the things that Hugh had brought up there was, and obviously Grainne as well, about the Taoiseach talking about kind of his role as one of those journeymen. We also saw that with Barack Obama as well in the States. I was just wondering if you think that beyond their own kind of political appeal and popularity, or lack thereof, maybe more so in the case of the Taoiseach sometimes, do you think that's an important role to have as part of a campaign, to identify someone that appeals more to maybe a conservative section of society, that makes it okay for you to initially have doubts, to bring that million in the middle with you, that's an important role maybe to play as part of that campaign?
Great, okay, and we take one more and then we come back to the panel for responses. Thank you.
Sonia Felton from Rehab. The conversation about the Coughlin judgment really struck a chord with me in terms of how that has impacted on referendum campaigns in this country over many years. On talking to people in the UK when the Brexit referendum was going on, they were saying there's nowhere to get true information. Anybody can say anything, and so there was no effectively referendum commission in the UK. But we have the referendum commission here, but we also have the Coughlin judgment, and those two things sometimes seem a little bit at odds in terms of the legal structures that are in place to support referendums. I think you can use both, Hugh. It's referenda or dums. But just, I'd be interested in your reflections on that, how it impacted on the campaign, the Coughlin judgment, and also how you think we should be fixing it for the next time, because it really did become very black and white this time, as opposed to there being any quality in the arguments. It was just about minutes and seconds, and I found that frustrating just watching it, let alone being a member of the campaign organisations. Thank you.
Okay, so we've 3 points: the opposition and how well it was managed, the role of journeymen, and that idea of journey, is it useful in a campaign? And then thirdly, the combination of the broadcasting limitations and maybe the role of the Referendum Commission. Hugh, we start maybe with you and just work our way up.
Yeah, I'll just, if it's okay, I mean, I'll address the point in relation to Enda Kenny and his kind of conversion on the issue, making it more acceptable for other people, perhaps. I mean, Enda Kenny he's what's known as the father of the Dáil. He's the longest serving TD. He's been 40 years in TD for Mayo. He's from the west of Ireland. He is in Fine Gael, which is traditionally seen as a very socially conservative party. I think that's changing a little bit. So he is not a guy who you would think would be in favour of this, to be blunt. And yet he came around to the idea, I think, because he spoke to people and people convinced him of the merits of this. And you know, the person, you know, the kind of the personal stories and the kind of campaign that Yes Equality ran. You know, there was a sort of those kind of personal stories really appeal to him. And he I mean, you know, I sound like I'm a massive Enda Kenny fan, but I mean, he is. He's done a lot wrong as Taoiseach, but he's just to point that out. But he has shown a willingness, not just with this issue, but with others, to change his mind on things. And he changed his mind on this because he was against it, and he was on the record as having been against it, I think 10, 12 years ago. That he didn't want to do it if he became Taoiseach. And so the fact that he came around to it, I think, was just an acknowledgement that the country had this was the way the country was going, and I think that was borne out in the result itself. The country has come along on this journey towards marriage equality, and he was going with it. And I think that was a hugely powerful thing to see an old man, 65, maybe that's not old, sorry, but it's old in my book. Yeah, that you know, and someone who'd been around politics, Irish politics, for a long, long time, and had lived through things, you know, like that, you know, the 1983 referendum on the Eighth Amendment and stuff like that. Through very socially conservative times that he'd come around to this issue. And I think we're seeing him change his mind in relation to the Eighth Amendment as well. I don't think he would have touched it with a barge pole 5 years ago, and now he's showing a willingness to at least acknowledge that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. And I think if this government lasts, that there will be a referendum, but that's a big if. And in terms of the Coughlin judgment and the challenges it presents, I think Jane touched on this, but you know, a permanent referendum commission, not one that is set up ad hoc every time we call a referendum, is absolutely crucial, I think, in this respect. We don't have one. There is legislation floating around the Dáil somewhere to establish a permanent referendum commission. But I think this would be enormously helpful to media organisations and the general public if we had a body that was permanently constituted that could you know, thrash out the various arguments and deal with the various issues that arise during a referendum. And Paddy's shaking his head. But I do think it's a very important thing to have.
Yeah, I think this is quite an interesting. It's quite an interesting argument. I disagreed with something Hugh said when he was talking. He was somewhat apologetic about the fact that the media were actually showed their colours in the course of the campaign. I make no bones about that. In a free society, the media should be able to have a view and express a view. The critical thing for good journalism is to present both sides of the argument, to explain the arguments. I think what happens when you have a sort of phony, legalistic anti-bias rule like the Coughlin judgment is that you neuter journalists. You make it impossible for journalists in RT, in the broadcasting media, to say, well, actually, that's a good argument, and that this is a bad argument. That is their function in a free society, is to explain, to explore, to discuss things. All they can do is sit like Egypts in the middle of a boxing ring and let people say across the table sometimes quite ridiculous things. I don't think we're well served by the Coughlin judgment. I think we're much better served by a free press in which these things can be thrashed out, and in which the truth is, at the end of the day, the people will decide whether statements are true or false. Sometimes they won't mind whether they're true or false, but they will decide based on who the statements are coming from and that person's track record. And that's a much better way of dealing with facts and disputed facts in a honest contestation of ideas than having some legal body ruling that, no, you can't say that. This is not relevant to the referendum. So I take issue with Jane about this too, because I think, frankly, a referendum commission, I don't think anybody was particularly convinced when the referendum commission came out and said, well, actually, this isn't part of the referendum campaign, and we shouldn't discuss it. It helped people in RTE, but that's because they were hogtied by the Cochrane judgment.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have the Cochrane judgment, and it would be free press, but the problem is that we don't live in an ideal world, and we do have the Cochrane judgment, and therefore you have to get around it. I think one of the problems is the interpretation of it, and even the BAI have said, yes, there has to be 50-50, that's what Cochrane has said, but there doesn't have to be 50-50 in every programme and every item. So just because I have Paddy on making his statement doesn't mean that I have to then get Breda O'Brien on to argue with them and time them both. I can have Paddy on one time and I can have Breda on later. I can, so long as the balance is there over the course of the day. But the problem is that RTE is so nervous because there's kind of serial complainants to the BAI anytime anything comes on that they don't agree with, that what they do is run the Conservative option and have this kind of stopwatch, I shout black, you shout white, and then people are meant to make up their minds. So yeah, in an ideal world they would, but on the other hand, a lot of people don't have the time or the patience to sit there. All they hear is competing arguments and they go, who are you going to believe? And, unless it is actually somebody they trust, people do actually trust their friends and their relatives and things, and that works, but other times they don't. So when we found with the Referendum Commission, it's very ad hoc the way it's set up, so yeah, it needs to be permanent, but also it doesn't actually have a specific role in kind of fact-checking. It sets out the arguments beforehand in the booklets that we get, yes and no, and at least those are actually generally reasonably factually true, unlike in Brexit, where they just asked the yes and no campaigns for what are your main arguments and then printed them and sent them to everybody. So the Referendum Commission in Britain actually printed the 350 million quid to the NHS line, because they said it. So at least we don't have that. But I think what we do need is legislation to empower the Referendum Commission, that if people come out with actually false statements that the thing isn't about, that you can then empower the broadcast journalists to say, actually, no, that's not what it's about something else. And print journalists don't need this empowerment. They have the freedom, but the broadcast journalists, I think, need the empowerment to be able to say to one side, it's not about that, and just shut down the argument when they attempt to bring it off tangentially.
Okay, thanks. Obviously, we had the Referendum Commission say that on numerous occasions. It still didn't stop the other side from repeating the lie. Fergus, I'll let you come in and just final comment on that.
2 points. I do want to address the religion issue, but just on the issue of the balance requirements, I think it is important to ensure that our broadcast media, that there is a diversity of voices there, and so I think it is important to make sure that our broadcast media aren't solely sending out one particular message. We look at, I suppose, broadcast media in other jurisdictions where very often you have television stations that are devoted solely to pushing one particular line. So I think it is important that we have diversity. The problem, I suppose, with the interpretation of balance is that, certainly in RTE, it seems to be that that requires a ding-dong debate where two people argue with each other about something, and there's more heat than light. The best example of good, I suppose, illuminating interviewing I found was on Radio na Gaeltacht. I remember listening to, that's an Irish language radio station, listening to a very lengthy question and answer session with a yes campaigner. Very illuminating. Obviously, at another point, they would have to have a discussion with somebody who was advocating for a no, but it was a lengthy, in-depth probe just with the yes campaigner. I presume they had a similar probing interview with somebody on the no side, but I felt that it helped to expose the arguments much more effectively. I think in that regard, certainly I found that particular programme much more effective than a lot of the ding-dong debates we had in RTE. It is worth bearing in mind that the balance requirement only applies to broadcast media. I met one print journalist actually during the campaign who noted that his newspaper was required to have balance. Well, there's no legal requirement on a newspaper, on print media, on the internet for there to be balance. The Broadcasting Act and the Coughlin decision, well, the Broadcasting Act specifically only applies to broadcasters. Just in relation to the religious issue, it is worth noting we have had civil marriage in Ireland since 1844, and I think one of the difficulties for the Yes campaign was to actually get into people's minds the idea that marriage was not solely a religious institution. Almost 30% of heterosexuals get married in civil ceremonies, and an increasing number also in secular ceremonies in Ireland. So you still have a majority of people get married in the church, but 1/3 of heterosexuals get married in civil marriages. There are also the people who are excluded from religious marriages for various different reasons. And so I think it's important, and this was one part of the message which I think was very effective, that this is a referendum about civil marriage, but marriage in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the state, rather than just in the eyes of your particular religion. It has to be said that the interventions from the churches tended not to go, in my eyes, didn't seem to go very well. And in particular, there were a number of interviews with bishops that didn't seem to get very positive responses. I think it's worth bearing in mind the Roman Catholic Church, the clout they had 20 years ago is gone. And in fact, there's an argument that intervention from priests and bishops actually didn't help the no side at all, that it tended to provoke a backlash. And in particular, given the various scandals and given the fact that you're dealing with a group of people who like marriage so much that they don't actually enter into it, it seemed to be a little bit odd that you had all, particularly speaking specifically about the Roman Catholic Church, a group of people who were lauding the virtues of heterosexual marriage in circumstances where they believe it is a virtue to avoid it. That makes no sense to me, and I think people saw through their arguments, particularly in the context of the various scandals that they were speaking so firmly about protection for children in the context of marriage, where they had patently failed to protect children for decades before that. I'm sorry for being angry about it, but I do feel very strongly about that.
Righteous anger is always appropriate,
Yeah.
Fergus. Well done. Okay, I'm going to have to bring to a close there. Want to thank each of our speakers for really interesting and I think thought-provoking conversations that I think we can carry on in the workshops later on this afternoon.